Hello there, high level listeners. We've got a brand new English vocabulary episode for you today from us here at High Level Listening. Today, we're diving into something fun and delicious, making your favorite recipe at home. Whether you're a seasoned chef or just starting out in the kitchen, we've got some useful cooking vocabulary and expressions to help you talk about your favorite dishes and recipes in high level English.
Yes, we definitely do. Welcome, everyone, to High Level Listening. This is our YouTube channel where we give you side-by-side British and American English. And as always, we've got two scripts for you. One focusing on American English with Kat, and one a little bit more in British English with me. We'll go through each recipe step by step, and then we'll go back to the start and we'll break down the key cooking terms, cooking vocabulary, techniques, and any interesting expressions to help take your English to the next level. Like always, remember you can download a PDF transcript of this episode and all of our other episodes if you join us as a high-level listening member. You can see how to do that in the link in the description below. So let's jump into today's topic. Kat, can you tell us a little bit about your favorite recipe and how you prepare it?
Ooh, yeah. Okay. So when it comes to cooking, one of my go-to recipes is kind of a basic homemade pasta with tomato sauce. It's simple, but always satisfying. First, I start by boiling a large pot of water, making sure to add a generous amount of salt. While the water is coming to a boil, I prepare the sauce. I like to use fresh tomatoes, which I blanch, peel, and dice, or sometimes I just use canned tomatoes to save on time. I saute some garlic and onions in olive oil until they're golden and fragrant, then add in the tomatoes, a pinch of salt, and some dried oregano. I let that simmer on low heat so the flavors can develop. In the meantime, the water's boiling, so I cook the pasta. Once the pasta's done, I drain it, toss it in the sauce, and finish with a sprinkle of Parmesan and fresh basil. Bon appetit! So what about you, Mark? Do you have a go-to recipe or what's one of your favorite recipes?
My favourite recipe has to be a classic British Sunday roast. It's a bit more time consuming, but definitely worth it. I start by preparing a nice cut of beef, like a rib roast. I season it with salt and pepper and a bit of mustard, and then roast it in the oven until it is perfectly medium rare. While the meat's cooking, I prepare the Yorkshire puddings, which are a must for any roast. I make a batter using eggs, flour, and milk and pour it into a hot pan with some oil to get that perfect rise. I also roast potatoes. I smother them in the juices from the roast so they get nice and crispy. For vegetables, I usually go with carrots, parsnips, and Brussels sprouts. Cook them in olive oil and thyme. Lastly, I make a rich, savoury gravy from the drippings of the roast and some corn flour to thicken it up. So there you go. Enjoy. Okay, so two quite different recipes there, but if you didn't catch everything from our scripts, don't worry. We'll go back to the start and go through them line by line, explaining and exploring the most important vocabulary and expressions to talk about cooking. So back to the beginning then. Kat, what was the dish that you like to make?
So when it comes to cooking, one of my go-to recipes is a fairly basic homemade pasta with tomato sauce. It's simple, but always satisfying. Now, when Mark was talking about his Sunday roast, I was drooling a little bit because mine really does sound quite basic now at this point. Okay, so when it comes to cooking, so when I'm talking about cooking, when it comes to cooking, one of my go-to recipes. Now, Mark had this really delicious sounding Sunday roast, but that kind of sounds like quite a special meal. Maybe he wouldn't have it all the time. One of my go-to recipes. So if you have a go-to, it's one of your favorite ones, and it might be really easy to put together, so it's your go-to. I don't know what to make tonight. I'm not really sure. Well, I guess I have some tomatoes, so I can use my go-to recipe. Now, this one is fairly basic. There's no fancy cooking strategies. There's no fancy ingredients, really. It's a fairly basic homemade pasta with tomato sauce. Now, sometimes when we say homemade, I know a lot of Italians out there might make their own pasta at home, but usually what we mean is we made the tomato sauce. Okay, so I probably bought the pasta and I made the tomato sauce at home. So it is a homemade tomato sauce, homemade pasta with tomato sauce. It's simple, but always satisfying. It's funny how sometimes the simplest recipes just are the most satisfying. And satisfying is kind of like it fills up a need. You know, you just didn't know that you needed it, but once you tasted it, oh, wow, it is just so satisfying. Simple, but always satisfying. All right, Mark, what about you? What's one of your favorite recipes?
My favourite recipe has to be a classic British Sunday roast. It's a bit more time consuming, but definitely worth it. So yes, I picked something more traditionally British. The meal is called a roast. So you order a roast, or I'm making a roast. A British roast usually has beef, because we have lots of cows in England, and our beef is very tasty. And it's a British Sunday roast because we eat it on Sundays. Traditionally, a lot of people in the UK will have a Sunday roast. You can make it at home, but you can also go out to pubs on Sundays and order them there as well. It's kind of a tradition. A roast is a large meal. It has meat, usually in the form of beef, and it has lots of vegetables. I mentioned quite a few vegetables in my recipe. If you have a Sunday roast, you'll probably have a small breakfast and eat your Sunday roast for lunch, and you will be so full you'll probably have a small dinner as well. So it's the biggest meal of the day. A lot of people really look forward to it during the week. Sometimes they buy the meat they need or buy the ingredients they need on Friday or Saturday, and they're just thinking about the Sunday roast the next day. Sometimes families also get together on Sundays, so I might visit my mum, or grandparents might invite their family over, because a roast can feed a lot of people. You can have like 6, 8, 10 people all enjoying a big Sunday roast. So yes, it's quite a big meal. It's a very traditional meal, and that's what I chose. It's called a roast, a British Sunday roast. Like I said, it's got lots of ingredients and lots of parts, so it's a bit more time consuming. If your recipe takes a lot of time to make, you need to wait for the meat, you need to wait for the vegetables or prepare a lot of vegetables. It's time consuming, but definitely worth it. It takes a long time, maybe 3-4 hours, but when you eat it, oh, you forget about all the time and the effort you put in. You forget about burning your hands, taking out the beef from the oven. It's definitely worth it. You might be starving when you sit down, but that will just make it more delicious. So it's definitely worth it. Have you ever tried a Sunday roast? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, absolutely. I think that was besides fish and chips, that is the one thing that I really wanted to try is a Sunday roast. I remember the person that was cooking in the kitchen, she was just like, "Don't talk to me. Don't don't help me with anything. Just leave me alone. I will cook everything." And I tried to help, but it took hours and hours and hours, and I wasn't allowed to help, so I just got to reap the rewards. I just got to eat the roast at the end.
Yes, that's my mum. She goes into roast mode. She's like,
Roast
get out of
mode.
the kitchen. I know what I'm doing. I have my recipe. Just leave me alone. I'll do it. I'll tell you when it's ready. It can be quite a stressful meal to make because there's just so many different ingredients cooking at
Would
different
you
temperatures and different times.
would you have this at Christmas as well, or kind of other times of year, or is it just kind of a Sunday thing?
You can eat it throughout the year, any time of year. It is really similar to Christmas dinner or Christmas lunch. The only difference is on Christmas, you'll cook turkey. Turkey will be
Got
the
it.
meat for Christmas. But the rest of the year, it's probably beef or gammon or sometimes chicken. My mum does chicken roasts as well. All right. So back to your recipe, the pasta with tomato. If we're talking about British and American differences,
Yeah, let's
you
let's
chose a
talk
good
about
one,
this. Let's
right?
have a chat
Yes.
about this.
Sure.
So I would say pasta and tomato sauce. Pasta and tomato sauce.
In a British accent, we say pasta and tomato. So Kat's cooking pasta with tomato sauce. Okay, so with your dish, what's the first step of the recipe?
So, first, I start by boiling a large pot of water, making sure to add a generous amount of salt. So, boiling a pot of water. Boiling is when you have the water so hot, the bubbles start to come out. That's when we know that it is boiling, or it's 100 degrees Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit. It's boiling. So, I start by doing something. I start by boiling a large pot of water, making sure to add a generous amount of salt. Now, usually when I'm cooking, I don't always follow the ingredients list. I don't always follow the exact recipe. This is just kind of, I have an idea. So I can add a generous amount of salt is a good amount. I don't want a pound of salt in there, but a generous amount, a pretty good amount of salt. What about you, Mark? When you're making your roast, what's the first step of the recipe?
I start by preparing a nice cut of beef, like a rib roast. I season it with salt and pepper and a bit of mustard, then roast it in the oven until it's perfectly medium rare. So I use the same structure as Kat. I said I start by, so I need ing. I start by preparing. I start by boiling. I start by preparing a nice cut of beef. If you go to a butcher's shop, a shop that sells meat, you can ask them to give you some meat. Meat is uncountable in English, so the way you can measure meat, like a little bit of meat, some meat, or a lot of meat, we have a cut of beef, a cut of chicken, a cut of pork. That's when they give you often a large piece. The butcher has a big knife and they cut some off and give it to you. So a cut of beef is a piece of beef, usually a large one. The part of the beef is a rib roast. Your ribs down the sides of your chest and the sides of a cow. There's a rib roast. That's the name of that piece of meat. And the first thing I do, I put salt and pepper on it. When you add these seasonings, there's a verb. You can say, I season the meat. I season it. Cat seasons the water with salt. I season the meat with salt, pepper, and a bit of mustard. The next step, I want to roast the meat. I can roast something in an oven. Almost every British household has a gas oven. It's essential if you want to make a roast. So I put the meat inside, close the door, and roast it. Roast it is cooking it in the oven, usually for quite a while. I think at least 30 minutes, but for meat, potentially 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes the heat is not super hot, so it cooks quite slowly, but that makes the texture and the flavor more delicious because it's worth the wait. So I'll roast it in the oven until it's perfectly medium rare. There are ways to measure how tough or how cooked meat is. If it's red and has a lot of blood, it's rare. If you cook it a bit longer, it's medium rare. Bit longer is medium, medium well, and well done. You might often, or more often, hear this referred to with steak. If you're eating steak, they will ask you, how do you want it cooked? My preference is medium rare. I said perfectly medium rare. So it's got a little bit of blood in it. It's still a bit soft and juicy. That's my favorite. How do you like your steaks, Kat? Do you like medium rare as well?
Oh, I'm rare, medium rare all the way. When I'm back in Texas, I think that the meat is a little bit nicer than some of the places that I visited. Or if I'm in France, the beef there is really good too. So I'll usually get rare or medium rare. Yeah, that's what I prefer as well.
All right, so you've added a generous amount of salt into the water. What's next?
So while the water is coming to a boil, I prepare the sauce. I like to use fresh tomatoes, which I blanch, peel, and dice, or sometimes I just use canned tomatoes to save on time. So I remember I had a pot of water. It needs to come to a boil. Okay. So it needs to heat up all the way to start boiling, right? So that takes a little bit of time, especially if you're getting water from the tap and the water's cold. You need to wait for the water to come to a boil. So while the water is coming to a boil or during that time, I prepare the sauce. Okay. So on one boiler, I have the water boiling. Okay, so it's coming to a boil over here. And then I'm going to prepare the sauce over on another boiler. I like to use fresh tomatoes, which I blanch, peel, and dice. There are so many verbs when it comes to cooking. I don't know any other subject that has this many verbs in such a short a period of time. Blanch, peel, and dice. So you've got a tomato, right? Just a regular sized tomato. And when you blanch something, you quickly put the tomato into hot water and then you remove it quite quickly. Okay, maybe a couple of minutes max. You can blanch broccoli, you can blanch vegetables, you can blanch a lot of things. What this really does is it just cooks a little bit and it kind of gives it a bright color. The nice thing about tomatoes is when you blanch them, the skin is really easy to peel off. Okay, so I blanch, then I peel. You can peel a banana, you can peel an apple. It's to remove the outer skin. Okay, so if you want to peel something, you can easily peel away the tomato skin. And then I'm going to dice it up. Dice, chop, quite similar. Dice or chop is to cut it into small pieces, all right? Blanch in the boiling water very quickly. Peel, take off the skin, and dice, chop or cut into small pieces. Now, that's a little time consuming. So if I don't have much time, sometimes I just use canned tomatoes, okay? Canned tomatoes sounds like canned tomatoes. Really, you can say canned, but it sounds like canned tomatoes. We've got canned beans, we've got canned chickpeas, we've got canned green beans, canned corn, anything that comes in a can, those vegetables. We could also use the word frozen. It's not as common to find frozen tomatoes. It's more common to find canned tomatoes where I'm from. So sometimes I just use canned tomatoes to save on time. All right, I do not have time to blanch, peel, and dice all of these things. So I'm just going to use canned tomatoes because I don't have a lot of time. Why? I just use canned tomatoes to save on time. All right, so what do you do next for your roast? My mouth is watering just thinking about a Sunday roast.
Right. Yeah, so it's going to get better as well. So the beef is in the oven. While the meat is cooking, I prepare the Yorkshire puddings, which are a must for any roast. I make a batter using eggs, flour, and milk, and pour it into a hot pan with some oil to get that perfect rise. So I am waiting for the meat. Like I said, it can take 2 hours or longer, so I have lots of time to do other things. So while the meat is cooking, or at the same time the meat is cooking, I prepare the Yorkshire puddings. You may...
What are these things?
Right.
I have
Sure.
no idea. Pudding? Pudding for me is like vanilla, like a dessert. It's called vanilla pudding, chocolate pudding. So I'm still a little confused as to what these are.
Yeah, this is another very traditional part of a British roast, British food. Yorkshire is one of the counties of England, one of the bigger ones in the north, and apparently they made Yorkshire puddings. It's not a dessert, it's a savoury thing. We might post a picture of one in the community after this episode, But imagine almost like a little cup made of bread. I
Oh,
made it using
okay.
eggs, flour, and milk, and it's crispy and fluffy and soft, and it goes on the plate with the meat and the
Okay.
vegetables. Some people
Do you
like
drink
to,
out of it?
yeah, you can. You can pour gravy into it and like drink it like it's from a cup.
No
Most people
way.
do not use their, no, most people will use
Oh,
their knife and fork and they will
okay.
cut it. But you put it together with the gravy, the vegetables, and the meat. Sometimes you can put them together on your fork and have some meat, vegetables, and a Yorkshire pudding and eat that in one
Okay.
mouthful.
All right.
And it's delicious.
This sounds very
It's
typical for you guys.
right. Yeah, it's funny that it's called pudding. We have a couple of things in the UK that are called pudding that are not desserts. Another example is black pudding, which you eat for breakfast, weirdly. But pudding is just a very traditional name for this thing. Like Kat mentioned, you can buy frozen ones if you don't want to
Mm,
make these, and that's a lot easier and saves a lot of time. A lot of people do that. But if I want to make Yorkshire puddings, it is like a bread, half cake kind of thing. So I need to make a batter. A batter is a mixture of eggs, flour, and milk. You can make batter and cover some meat with it and then fry it, and it will be a crispy, delicious skin. In this case, I'm going to make a batter using eggs, flour, and milk and put it in the oven. I pour it into a hot pan with some oil to get that perfect rise. Yorkshire puddings are fun to make because they're quite small and they cook very quickly. If you look through the window of the oven, you can watch them rise. They
mhm.
puff up and they grow. It's like popcorn in slow motion. And you often make 6 or 7 or 8. Usually on one plate, you can have 2 Yorkshire puddings or maybe 3 if you're really hungry. So if you're feeding a big group, you could make a big batch, a lot of puddings. And yes, it's very fun to watch them rise in the oven like bread or like muffins or something like that, or like cookies. So that is my very basic recipe of Yorkshire puddings. Again, it's hard to explain, so we'll put a picture on the community, which will hopefully be more appetizing or make more sense when you see a photo,
I like the idea of a cup of bread. Like,
right?
I like
It's
that idea. I mean,
food.
it's like you wouldn't have a bread roll. You would have a Yorkshire pudding, right?
Yes. Yeah. It replaces the need for a slice
Right.
of bread or a roll or
Got
something
it.
like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I can get behind that. Yeah.
Sure. They are great. Sometimes they're my favorite part of the roast, actually, more than the meat
Okay.
or anything else. Yeah. Okay. So you've prepared the water and you've prepared the tomatoes. What do you do after that? What's the next step of your recipe?
So after I've diced up the tomatoes, I saute some garlic and onions in olive oil until they're golden and fragrant. Then add in the tomatoes, a pinch of salt, and some dried oregano. I let that simmer on low heat so the flavors can develop. Now, we have a lot of French words that we use in cooking. I saute some garlic and onions in olive oil. We can use the word fry. I think this is lightly frying. I think usually when you fry something, you're going to use quite a bit of oil. And then when you saute something, you're going to use a little bit less oil. That's really the biggest difference. You can use fry and saute very similarly. So I'm going to saute some garlic and onions in olive oil until they're golden and fragrant. You know, you can smell the garlic, and right when the garlic smells or there's a fragrance, then you have to turn off the heat after that or add something in there, right? So once they're golden, especially when you fry something, it gets that beautiful color that starts to almost burn, but it's cooking through, right? Until they're golden and fragrant. That means I can smell the onions, I can smell the garlic in the air. Then Add in the tomatoes. Remember all of those beautiful tomatoes that I worked on, or my canned tomatoes if you need to save on some time. A pinch of salt. Now, in my boiling water, I have a generous amount of salt. So that's a good amount of salt. Now, here, I just need a pinch. Now, a pinch, like, when Auntie comes over to you and pinches your cheek, just a little pinch of salt and some dried oregano. It'd be nice to have fresh, but most of my seasonings are going to be dried, D-R-I-E-D. Notice that when we have an adjective with these items, we have dried oregano, canned tomatoes, roasted things. Okay, so we have dried oregano. I think this is one of the differences, Mark, with pronunciation. Do you say oregano?
It's oregano.
Oregano. What?
I had no idea why. I don't really cook with it that often, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
oregano.
that's so interesting. Okay, so dried oregano. Don't worry too much about it. Sometimes we're different, right? I let that simmer on low heat so the flavors can develop. Now, you don't want to just put the tomatoes, onions, garlic, and say, okay, it's ready. No, they kind of need some time to simmer. 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 To simmer is when we put a liquid on a low heat just to kind of let all the flavors come together, right? So if you're going to boil some water or boil a liquid or a soup, that's really going to have lots of bubbles. When we turn down the heat, but the heat is still on, that's when we're going to let it simmer. Because we also don't want all the liquid to boil out, all of the water to boil out, because then you might burn something at the bottom. That's why we let things simmer on low heat so the flavors can develop. Right now, it's like we have lots of pieces, but we want all the pieces to come together and we want the flavor to develop. So the longer that we can cook it on a low heat, the better the taste, right? The better the flavors. Okay, so Mark, you made those delicious sounding little Yorkshire pudding cup things that you were talking about. So what are you going to do next?
I also roast potatoes. I smother them in the juices from the roast so they get nice and crispy.
Mm.
Yes, so I'm roasting pretty much everything. You can understand why it's called a Sunday roast, because literally every ingredient is roasted. Maybe the Yorkshire puddings are baked, but that's about it. So you can take potatoes, chop them up or dice them up if you want to, and put them in the oven. When you put stuff in the oven, you will roast it. Again, roasting is cooking it for quite a while, 30 minutes or more. Potatoes are a key ingredient of any Sunday roast. So I roast potatoes. That means they stay in a potato shape. I don't mash them or cut them into slices or anything. It is a potato. Some people, like Kat said, might peel the potatoes, but not every family. It depends on the family. My mum just throws them in.
But
and
how
roasts
big are
them
your
like normal.
potatoes? Because in America, our potatoes are really big. So I probably wouldn't roast a whole potato.
Oh, right. Yeah, so you can get different varieties. Some are
Mm.
like as big as my fist, and that would be too big. You might cut
Okay.
that into smaller pieces.
That's what I'm used to for roasted potatoes. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, you can buy smaller potatoes and just roast them whole as well. Again,
Okay.
depends on the family. And then because I have the roast, the meat, the beef, after that cooks for a while, it's sitting in a pan and the juices from the meat are starting to come out. Again, it can do that because I'm cooking it at a slightly low temperature. And one trick that lots of people like to do is take the juices and add it to other ingredients in the roast. The juice is quite salty and tastes meaty, and it also makes the skin on the potatoes very crispy. So when you bite it, it's like, it's super nice. So this is a trick. you can take that juice and smother. To smother is to really cover every part of something. You could take some meat, take some gravy, and smother it in gravy. That's putting a lot of liquid on it. Kids might get their food and smother it in tomato ketchup because kids just love sweet things. So when you smother something, you cover it in a lot of liquid. And I smother the roast potatoes in the juices from the roast so they get nice and crispy. That is a nice trick. I think a lot of British families do this. You can also have some people use fat or like goose fat. They smother the potatoes in goose fat, and that makes them like golden and crispy. That's super delicious as well. Okay, back to your recipe, Kat. You've got the water, the tomatoes. Now you've got a sauce. What's the next step?
So, in the meantime, the water's boiling, so I cook the pasta, right? So I've kind of put some things together, and then I'm moving on to the other thing. And then that's kind of put together, and I move on to the other thing. So in the meantime, while my pasta sauce is simmering, in the meantime, or during that time, the water's boiling now. So I cook the pasta. Once the pasta's done, that's it. Once the steak is done, once the sauce is done, we use this word a lot, just it's ready to eat. So once the pasta's done, however you want the doneness, a little bit chewy, a little bit soft. Once the pasta's done, I drain it, toss it in the sauce, and finish with a sprinkle of Parmesan and fresh basil. So I drain the pasta. Now, in your sink, you have the tap at the top where you turn on and off the water. And then when you're finished with the water in the sink, it goes down a hole at the bottom called the drain. Now, I don't put my pasta directly into the sink to go down the drain, but I will drain the pasta. So I will usually get what's called a colander or a strainer, and it's kind of like a bowl with holes in it. So I'm going to drain it. So I pour all of the pasta water and the pasta into this bowl. The water will drain out, and then I'm left with the pasta. So once the pasta's done, I drain it, toss it in the sauce. Okay, so now I'm just going to put the pasta into the sauce. So I'm going to just toss it in the sauce. I think usually when I say toss, I mean like lightly mix it. I don't want to really be making a mess, right? By mixing it too thoroughly. I'm just going to toss it. So toss it in the sauce and finish with a sprinkle, like ice cream sprinkles, just a little bit on top, nice and light. A sprinkle of Parmesan. Now, this is the American way to say Parmesan cheese, which is a kind of a special, a little bit tangy cheese that we like to use on spaghetti sauce. And we have a sprinkle of Parmesan and fresh basil. Now, I think this is another one, Mark, where we have a difference in pronunciation. Parmesan.
Yeah, Parmesan.
Parmesan.
Just like the Italians, I assume. Parmesan.
Pasta and Parmesan.
Pasta.
Yeah.
Pasta and Parmesan and oregano. No, wait, how do we say it? Yeah, oregano. That's right. I forgot. And then
life
the herb
is just different sometimes. The herb.
The last one is, oh God, even that's different.
We have so many differences here.
Right.
Yeah.
The herb
off the top of my head, no, it's basil.
Yeah, basil, like the name.
Oh my goodness.
Basil.
Okay, let's do a quick rundown. So pasta, tomato, oregano, Parmesan,
basil,
zucchini.
Oh, what do we call that? A courgette.
Yeah. Eggplant.
An aubergine.
Oh my gosh.
Right. We use the French words a bit more often. This is probably the episode with the most differences.
It really
we've
is.
ever done.
It really is. People think, I think it's clothing, cars, and cooking. I think those three have some of the biggest vocabulary differences for some reason. That's very funny. I like that. Okay, well, I put on my Parmesan and fresh basil with my tomato sauce. Now, what about you, Mark? Most of these vegetables that you've got, we say exactly the same. So, what vegetables do you usually cook with?
For vegetables, I usually go with carrots, parsnips, and Brussels sprouts and cook them in olive oil and thyme. So I can choose lots of vegetables. Again, different families do Sunday roasts differently. I go with carrots. I choose carrots. So when you're deciding what to use, I think I will go with carrots, parsnips, and Brussels sprouts. Some families also add kind of broccoli, swede, sweet potato, cauliflower cheese. There's lots of alternatives. But I usually go with carrots, parsnips, which are like a white carrot, Brussels sprouts, which are little green cabbages that you boil.
They're good,
and
huh?
I cook them. Yeah, well, controversial. Some people hate Brussels sprouts.
I don't like them
I'm not a massive
boiled. I
fan.
like them roasted or I like them fried. Yeah.
Mm. And I cook them in olive oil and thyme. Thyme is a herb. That's Thyme. Thyme. So, yes, I'm going to roast them again because I'm roasting everything. So I cook them in olive oil and thyme. Maybe I'll sprinkle some thyme on top. Okay, so near the end of your recipe out, is there anything left to do?
No, it's time to dig in. So, bon appetit. We do say bon appetit. One of the funniest jokes on the internet right now is people think it's bone apple tea, like the three words bone apple tea. But we do try to say it bon appetit or bon appetit. If you go to France and they say bon appetit, but most Americans just say bon appetit. All right. What about you, Mark? We have to go eat lunch after this. So what's left to do?
Yeah, so there's still one last step, one very important step on a Sunday roast. Lastly, I make a rich, savoury gravy from the drippings of the roast and add some corn flour to thicken it up. So there you go. Enjoy. So gravy. Gravy is a sauce that you pour on top of the meat and the vegetables and all over the Sunday roast. I like to smother the Yorkshire puddings, the vegetables in gravy. The way you make the gravy is using some more of the juices from the roast. I used a slightly different word this time, the drippings of the roast. Dripping, you might know as water dripping from the ceiling, or if it's very hot outside and you have a cold iced coffee, it will drip. That's the meat in the oven. Like it's very hot in there. It's like the meat is kind of sweating and the juices are dripping off. Like I did with the vegetables, the roast potatoes, you can collect those drippings and you can mix it together to make a gravy. Part of the gravy, one of my mum's little tricks to make gravy thicker is to add an ingredient called corn flour, and she adds it in to thicken the gravy. So you make something thicker, you thicken the sauce. Kat leaves her tomato sauce on a low heat to help it thicken. It's not very liquidy or watery. It becomes thicker, so it thickens. This is like widen or lengthen or heighten. So thicken it up. Corn flour makes the gravy thicker. Corn flour thickens it up or thickens it more. So there you go. Enjoy. Kat said bon appetit. Yep, it's probably the only French phrase that some British people know. But when you put food in front of a friend or someone, say enjoy. In a restaurant, for example, the waiter might put food on your table. Enjoy. That is our English version of bon appetit. Just enjoy. That's true in the UK and in the US as well.
All right, so there you have it. Lots and lots of useful phrases, vocabulary, and expressions to help you talk about making your favorite recipes in high level English. We would love to hear from you in the comments, so why don't you tell us? Which recipe would you like to try, mine or Mark's? What recipe do you like to make? Can you use any of the phrases from the video to tell us a little bit more about your favorite recipe?
Yes, more importantly, are you hungry after listening to this episode? We hope so, and not at the same time. But yes, we do reply and read all the comments that we get here on YouTube. So please get in touch and let us know. Like always, you can get the PDF transcript of this episode and all of our other episodes as well. That's a file with every sentence of this episode you can download and take offline. If you become a High Level Listening member by clicking the link below, you can get access to all of those right now.
Thank you so much, everyone. We really do appreciate all of our students, and thank you so much for liking this video and subscribing to us here at High Level Listening. We have brand new videos for you every week, and so we will see you for our next video very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.